Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other member opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I now ask unanimous consent that the following members be permitted to ask questions of the witnesses at today's hearing: Representative Case of Hawaii, Representative Sablan of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Representative Radewagen of American Samoa. I also ask unanimous consent for Representative Steve Womack of Arkansas to be allowed to introduce a witness. So ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I now recognize myself for my opening statement. I want to recognize the important bipartisan nature of this hearing. We are joined today by members of both parties who do not normally sit on this subcommittee, but who recognize that the United States has both a moral and national security imperative to address our nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands. Today's hearing is about Runit Dome, a concrete tomb for radioactive waste from U.S. nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands. To understand this, we need to go back 75 years. From 1946 to 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands. These tests had an explosive yield equivalent to 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs every day for 12 years. These tests helped the U.S. win the Cold War, but at an unimaginable cost to the Marshallese people: a 50% rise in cancer rates, eviction from ancestral islands, and the permanent destruction of a way of life. At the time, the U.S. administered the Marshall Islands as a trust territory for the United Nations, with absolute responsibility for the health and welfare of the Marshallese people. In the words of President Harry Truman, the Marshallese were, quote, wards of the U.S. for whom this country had special responsibilities, quote. So it is especially shocking to revisit this chapter in our history. In 1954, the U.S. detonated a bomb as powerful as 1,000 Hiroshimas on the Marshallese atoll of Bikini. American leaders learned before that test that wind patterns could expose people living on those islands to deadly fallout. Radioactive dust fell like snow in some places, but more than 2 days passed before people were evacuated. Later, mothers birthed jellyfish babies that emerged from the womb with transparent skin and no bones. One atoll was called, quote, by far the most contaminated place on Earth, quote, by an American official. That official nonetheless suggested sending islanders back because of the opportunity for more scientific research. Quote, it will be very interesting to get a measure of human uptake when people live in a contaminated environment, quote. He said, while it is true that these people do not live the way Westerners do, civilized people, it is nevertheless also true that these people are more like us than the mice, end quote. In 1986, the Republic of the Marshall Islands became a fully independent sovereign country, and along with Palau and the Federated States of Micronesia, it entered into the Compacts of Free Association with the U.S., giving the U.S. control over military and foreign affairs in exchange for economic assistance. The compact also addressed claims related to U.S. nuclear tests. Section 177 of the compact gave the Marshallese $150 million for damages, and in return, the Marshallese gave up all legal claims to sue the United States. But while the compact closed the door to the courts, it intentionally left open the doors to Congress and to the White House. It said that if new information came to light, or the 150 million proved inadequate, the Marshallese could ask to reconsider the deal. And for the record, that 150 million was less than 10% of the damages ultimately awarded under Section 177. And the U.S. hid classified information on the testing program from the Marshall Islands when they were negotiating the deal. Some of that information is still classified 70 years later. So while this hearing today is not about the compacts or Section 177, they are essential context. Since 2012, Congress has required the Department of Energy to conduct groundwater monitoring at Runit Dome. That dome is leaking and the danger is unclear. By law, Energy is supposed to conduct groundwater testing with funding and oversight from the Department of Interior. Though it appears neither of these agencies are fulfilling their responsibilities that Congress set to them, I appreciate their participation in today's hearing. I have grave misgivings about the decision of the Department of State to not attend. The State Department provides guidance to Energy and Interior on their legal obligations in the Marshall Islands related to Runit Dome and on the U.S. nuclear legacy more broadly. Their views are certain to be discussed today. The State Department gave various reasons for not attending, including a lack of knowledgeable personnel, a lack of time to prepare, and a lack of jurisdiction for this subcommittee. And those excuses are false. In fact, the State Department spent a considerable amount of time instructing our witnesses today on what not to say. That attitude toward congressional oversight and the Marshallese people echoes a dark chapter in our history. The Biden administration promised to restore America's reputation in the world, rebuild alliances, prioritize racial justice, and counter China. It has an opportunity to do all of these things in the Marshall Islands, but that requires a good faith approach to the nuclear issue, starting with Runit Dome. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Gozar, for any statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today's hearing underscores the importance of the strategic relationship between the United States and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. The world has experienced 70 years of mostly peaceful times in the Pacific region, due in part to our relationship with freely associated states. We can't afford for Mr. Biden to fumble the negotiations discussing the renewal of the Compact of Free Association between the United States and the Marshall Islands. Ensuring successful negotiation begins with assessing steps taken by the Biden administration to continue the discussion initiated under President Trump. I am glad the Biden administration is finally providing witnesses to appear before the subcommittee. As the 2023 expiration of this current compact is fast approaching, it is imperative that the administration provide an update on the status of such negotiations. If Mr. Biden wants to renew our compact with the Marshall Islands, if he fails to renew our compact with the Marshall Islands, he could be handing China yet another win. Despite Mr. Biden's apparent intent to, quote, build China back better, end quote, by closing off American mining opportunities and shutting down domestic energy development, we cannot let him create another crisis in the Pacific. Some may wonder, is the Chinese threat merely hypothetical? Alarmingly, it is not. In fact, over the past decade, China has significantly increased its engagement with islands in the Pacific Ocean. More concerning are recent news reports detailing China's test of a hypersonic missile. In fact, the second one. China, however, is claiming they were just conducting a routine test of a spacecraft, though I'm not too inclined in the Chinese government. Either way, it calls the attention to the Chinese expanding military capacity. This should be a red flag for Mr. Biden, and we should be taking steps to combat the spread of Chinese influence. I'm glad we are joined today by Mr. Ding Chang as he shares his expertise on Chinese political and security affairs. His testimony will help us understand the ambitions of the Chinese government and the consequences of failing to renew our compact with the Marshall Islands. A good relationship with the Marshall Islands is a key element of the United States' national security. That is one of the reasons it is so important to ensure timely negotiations of the Compact of Free Association between our two nations. Randall Shiver, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, put it best, testifying, quote, "Compact financial assistance is a good deal for the U.S. national security," end of quote. Maintaining our partnership is a win for the United States, plain and simple. Though our agreement of the agreement, the United States is able to establish a strong military presence in the Pacific region. On the Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, we have invested $2 billion in military infrastructure. With this investment, the United States Army and the United States Air Force can conduct vital space and missile defense research. Specifically, the Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense Test Site is located on the Kwajalein Atoll. The importance of this site cannot be overstated due to its ballistic missile testing capabilities. Our national security is strengthened because of our ability to maintain the site on the Marshall Islands. Today, these defense capabilities are even more crucial given the Chinese recent missile testings. Not only can the United States maintain a military presence on the Marshall Islands, we are also granted the right of strategic denial. Why is this right so advantageous for our national nation security? Because it allows the United States to prevent any other country from establishing a military presence in the Marshall Islands. Ultimately, the right of strategic denial is an additional way for us to combat China's expansion in the Pacific. Our compact agreement is a win-win for the United States and the Marshall Islands. In exchange for strategic advantages, the United States provides the Marshall Islands with security and economic assistance. Undermining this relationship leaves us both vulnerable to China. I hope the majority will join me in urging the Biden administration to renew our compact with the Marshall Islands before its expiration. We cannot afford to harm our relationship with such a valuable ally. Finally, I would like to point out, Madam Chair, that once again, here we are in a meeting in a remote capacity. Earlier this week, the majority, you, chose to hold an in-person hearing and denied remote access attendance to members not willing to travel to the state of California, which has the highest COVID cases in the nation. I guess they considered that hearing on the devastating impacts of the Biden supply chain crisis important enough to attend in person. Or maybe it was a cynical attempt to deny all members the option to participate remotely. Clearly, the majority seems committed to playing games with the committee meetings. This is remote, that is in person, this is a hybrid. The reality is it is far past time for the committee to return to Washington, D.C. and conduct our business in person. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gosar. Now I would like to turn to our first panel. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use stage view so that they can pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. We have 2 panels today. We will do panel 1 and questions, and then proceed to panel 2, statements, and then questions. Now I want to introduce our first government witness. Mr. Matthew Morey is the Associate Undersecretary for Environment, Health, Safety, and Security at the Department of Energy. The chair now recognizes Mr. Matthew Morey to testify.
Good morning, Chairperson Porter, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Matthew Morey, and I am DOE's Associate Undersecretary for Environment, Health, Safety, and Security. My office is responsible for overseeing health and environmental activities conducted on behalf of DOE in and for the Republic of Marshall Islands. The DOE Marshall Islands program was established in 1977. The program is part of the U.S. response to the legacy of nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands from 1946 to 1958. The 4 nuclear affected atolls included in the DOE Marshall Island program are Bikini, Anahuac, Rongelap, and Utrik. The inhabitants of Bikini and Anahuac, where the nuclear testing occurred, have been relocated prior to the test and were not exposed to local fallout. However, the inhabitants of Rongelap and Utrik were not relocated and due to shifting wind patterns were exposed to local fallout from the test. There are 3 main components of the DOE Marshall Island program: the Special Medical Care Program, Environmental Radiological Monitoring, and the Runit Dome Containment Structure Assessment and Monitoring. DOE coordinates all activities in the Marshall Islands with the U.S. Departments of State and Interior. The Special Medical Care Program provides annual and follow-up comprehensive screening, examinations, and treatment for people from Rongelap and Utrecht who are exposed to radioactive fallout from the Castle Bravo nuclear weapons test. All expenses associated with the examinations and treatment are covered by DOE. There were 253 people on the Rongelap and Utrecht atolls during the Castle Bravo test. As of October 2021, there are 77 remaining participants in this program. The environmental monitoring program characterizes the extent of radioactive exposure within the population and the extent of radiological contamination environment of the RMI. Together, the individual and environmental radiological monitoring programs provide high-quality measurement data and reliable dose assessments used by DOE to build a strong technical and scientific foundation to assist in recommending strategies for reducing uptake of radioactive materials and providing resettlement support to the residents of the 4 affected atolls. The Insular Acts of 2011 requires DOE to periodically conduct a visual study of the exterior of the Runit Dome and implement a radiochemical analysis monitoring program of the groundwater in and around the structure. The Department of the Interior provides partial funding for DOE's Runit Island activities. Beginning in May 2013, DOE worked in close coordination with the RMI to reestablish groundwater monitoring previously created by a National Academy of Science researchers both on the dome and in the surrounding area. From 2013 to 2018, multiple missions were conducted to collect water samples for radiochemical analysis and modeling using the reestablished boreholes, with an initial report published following the 2013 sampling work. During this time, multiple missions also assessed the condition of the dome. In 2020, DOE provided a report to Congress on the status of the Runit Dome as mandated in the NDAA Act for 2020. The conclusion reached by DOE in this report included: first, the Runit Dome is not in any immediate danger of collapse or failure, and the exterior concrete covering with containment structure is still serving its intended purpose. 2, the main risk posed by the dome will be derived from the flow of contaminated groundwater from beneath the containment structure into the local marine environment. 3, individual radiological protection monitoring data collected from the department's Marshall Islands program indicate radiation dose rates to individuals on Anahuac from internal exposure to fallout radionuclides are well below international standards for radiological protection of the public. And finally, the most notable and immediate impact of rising sea levels on the Runit Dome is associated with the physical effects of storm surge and wave-driven flooding. DOE's proposed groundwater radiochemistry analysis program is designed to provide some understanding of possible effects of forcing events such as storm surge on changes in groundwater quality. Following the 2018 sampling and inspection missions, DOE determined that a more robust network of groundwater monitoring wells would improve our analysis capability and begin planning for them. Radiochemical analysis of groundwater is a small aspect of the work to complete the groundwater monitoring effort, and additional work is necessary to complete the program. Based on our earlier discussions with your staff, we understand translating DOE documents from English into Marshallese is of interest. While DOE has not initiated a large-scale program to translate Marshall Islands program documents into Marshallese, to improve communication and transparency, we have undertaken to translate some presentations from previous meetings and an informational presentation on the Runit Dome to Marshallese. The department is in continual communication and coordination with the government and citizens of the RMI regarding activities associated with the DOE Marshall Island program. My management team and I are personally committed to the continued improvement and success of this program, and we are prepared to commence the next phase of the program that have been impacted by the pandemic when traveling restrictions are lifted. Pending your question, that completes my testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morey. Our second government witness is Mr. Nicola Pula, the Director of the Office of Insular Affairs at the Department of the Interior. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pula to testify.
Thank you, Chair Porter, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee. I thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony to your hearing this morning. I am Nicolau Pula, Director of the Office of Insular Affairs at the Department of the Interior. My statement focuses on the Interior's role in the Marshall Islands in the years following the United States nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands from 1946 to 1958. The United States has recognized the effects of its testing
I
and has
certainly intend to
accepted
support the legislation. I appreciate your commitment to help us make.
On its responsibility to the Marshall Islands, as reflected in the Compact and the Section 177 Agreement, which included a full settlement of all claims, past, present, and future, arising from or in any way related to the United States testing program. Since then, Interior, through the Office of Insular Affairs, has administered several programs in what is now the Marshall Islands and has funded payments under statutes passed by the Congress. United States agencies have occasionally sent personnel to inspect the condition of Runit Dome. This has been done ex gratia. Interior has provided Energy $2.1 million to conduct radiochemical analysis of the Runit groundwater pursuant to the Insular Areas Act of 2011. In February of 2013, Interior began discussions with Energy regarding the funding that Interior would provide necessary for these tests. To facilitate the transfer of these funds, Interior and Energy entered into a reimbursable support agreement under which Interior transferred to Energy $215,200 in fiscal year 2013, the same amount in fiscal year 2014, and $1.6 million in fiscal year 2019, which covered a portion of the cost to conduct radiochemical analysis of the Runit groundwater. The current reimbursable agreement remains in effect until September 2023. As of July this year, there was an unspent balance of $1.2 million. Through the 4-Atoll Healthcare Program, Interior addressed the medical needs of the people from Enewetak, Bikini, Rongelap, and Utri, who were affected by the nuclear tests. In fiscal year 2021, Interior provided $1.7 million, which included for each of the 4 atolls a full-time primary care physician working with a full-time island-based health assistant. This program improves access to quality and special care. In fiscal year 2017 to 2020, Interior awarded discretionary grants to the Marshall Islands for a variety of purposes, specifically technical assistance, maintenance assistance, and other programs like the Coral Reef Initiative. The discretionary grant disbursements in the past 4 years totaled $11.3 million, of which $5 million remains unspent. Chair Porter, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee, Interior stands ready to work with you. This subcommittee has a willing partner in Interior as we continue to implement programs, including those related to the United States nuclear testing program. I look forward to answering your questions, and I thank you for this opportunity to speak before the subcommittee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pula. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I will begin by recognizing myself. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the Department of Energy's letter to the Marshall Islands from May 2021. Mr. Mori, your office wrote this letter to the Marshallese government in which you said monitoring activities at the nuclear waste site at Runit Dome have been provided pursuant to the Insular Areas Act of 2011. Mr. Mori, have you completed the groundwater testing required by law?
The groundwater testing program is not complete. We started out.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, Mr. Mori, if the groundwater testing is not complete, which is consistent with your testimony, your written testimony today, why does this letter say, quote, all monitoring activities at the nuclear waste site at Runit Dome have been provided?
Well, we have been conducting radiochemistry analysis of the Runit Dome based on the available boreholes. Those boreholes are not adequate, so we will have to go further to get additional information.
It seems to me that this letter, which is from your deputy, it says that the testing, that monitoring has been done, and your testimony today here is that in fact additional monitoring remains to be done. The letter is from your deputy, and it says, quote, "The secretary asked me to reply on her behalf." Did the secretary tell your deputy to write to a foreign government and make an incorrect statement of fact in the middle of sensitive diplomatic talks?
That was assigned to our office by the secretary's office to respond.
So did the secretary direct your deputy to make an incorrect statement of fact in the middle of sensitive diplomatic talks?
No, the secretary did not instruct us to provide a incorrect statement, and I do not believe that is a totally incorrect statement.
You do not believe it is totally incorrect?
No, you're implying that we were not doing any monitoring analysis. We have been doing monitoring analysis.
No, I am not, sir. What this says is that the monitoring activities have been completed. That is incorrect.
That's referring to the groundwater monitoring programs. We are not complete. That is correct.
Mr. Maury, I would like to see the correspondence relating to the drafting of this letter by the end of the month. Are you willing to provide that?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pula, I now want to talk about Runit Dome. As you know, the U.S. tested the equivalent of 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs in the Marshall Islands every day for 12 years. And some of the most toxic waste is buried here, and it's leaking into the water. In his testimony, Mr. Maury says that the Marshall Islands, quote, "bear full responsibility for maintaining and monitoring Runit Dome." Do you agree with that statement?
No, I don't.
Okay, and can you explain why you don't agree with that statement?
Well, because there's so much stuff that went in there, and unfortunately, Madam Porter, the Department of Interior doesn't really do any work with that. The difference between owner, so the Marshall Islands kind of own the area, and then the ability for, I would say, to do things that the United States, basically, if we look at the tests, as you mentioned, all that stuff that's there, there is some bearance of responsibility of the United States to work with the Marshall Islands, even though it was given to them
Okay,
after the
Mr. Pula,
1980s.
I'm gonna push. I really appreciate you acknowledging that the United States has continued responsibility with regard to Runit Dome. I'm very glad to hear that, and I'm glad to hear you disagree with Mr. Maury and apparently perhaps the Department of State. We don't know because they're not here on that point. You said that the Marshall Islands owns the Runit Dome, and I just want to push back on that. Because in section 177 of the agreement, which I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record, it says that we give the rights, title, and interest to the sunken ships and the cables, transfers from the U.S. to the Marshall Islands. All it says about Runit Dome is that we give the rights to the Marshall Islands for utilization of the area. That's the equivalent of putting up a no trespassing sign. The people who drafted COFA knew how to give away full property interests. They did it with the sunken ships. They did it with the cables. That means you say rights, titles, and interests. I'm a law professor. I know how to give away property. With Runit Dome, we said use of the area is with the Marshallese people. So we did not, in fact, it is an incorrect interpretation of law to say that Marshall Islands owns Runit Dome. So given that, I think it's I'm really grateful to hear you acknowledging the responsibility that the United States has to continue to address the nuclear legacy at Runit Dome. With that, I yield back. Nice. Mr. Gosar for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Pula, thank you for joining us as a witness today. The Department of Interior is one of the agencies tasked with the negotiating of the renewal of the United States Compact, a free association with the Marshall Islands. We know negotiations began under the Trump administration. What is the status of the compact negotiations now?
Mr. Gosar, the negotiations are still ongoing at this moment.
So now the Trump administration has appointed the Assistant Secretary for Insular Affairs and International Affairs to represent the department in the negotiations surrounding the compact renewal. Who at your agency is responsible for leading those important negotiations?
At this moment, because the department is still waiting for confirmation of its assistant secretary, similar to the last administration. So we have with us a deputy assistant secretary, Mr. Keone Nakoa. He is joining Ambassador Stewart of the State Department as co-negotiators for the U.S. government.
Thank you. The Marshall Islands are a key ally, and we want to ensure their negotiations are being given the appropriate level of attention. Can you describe the time the department has devoted in conducting these negotiations, seeing that they come renewal in 2023, including the number of meetings you have held with the Marshallese during the Biden administration?
During the Biden administration, there were some meetings, and as of course at the time, and still is, because of the COVID, there was restriction on, meeting together, traveling and all that. So there were some meetings that occurred virtually among the then negotiators and the leaders of the freely associated states compact and negotiating teams.
Can you provide us with an actual number?
Okay,
I know it doesn't matter if they're in distance or in virtual. We want to make sure that the time is running out at 2023, and so this needs to be a priority item.
Yes, sir. It is a priority item. As a matter of fact, as I was preparing for this testimony, Mr. Keone was on a conversation with some of the freely associated folks yesterday.
Yeah. Now, so in your opinion, will the compact negotiations be successfully completed before the current compact's expiration in 2023?
It is a very high level hope of the Biden-Harris administration to be able to do that. We have started, like you mentioned, with the last administration. We are working very hard right now to engage with the freely associated states negotiating teams. Perhaps there may be a person-to-person meeting, hopefully in maybe a couple of weeks.
And what kind of priority is on the renegotiation of that compact?
It's very high. As a matter of fact, President of Palau came over here and visited with our secretary. I was in the meeting, and Secretary of the Interior has given it high priority. As a matter of fact, the Office of Congressional Liaison Affairs of the department, as well as the Solicitor's Office, and everybody up to our Deputy Secretary are all aware it's a very high level engagement with the NSC as well as the OMB.
Well, I know you're aware, but this needs to have high priority, just FYI. Mr. Mowry, in your testimony, you detailed the work of the Department of Energy's Marshall Islands program. What is the total amount of assistance this program has provided the Marshall Islands? Mr. Mowry?
Sorry, technical difficulty unmuting. The total amount of money that has been provided to the Marshall Islands since its very inception from DOE was approximately $180 million. The focus on our discussion today relative to Runit Dome, the funding that we have provided totals approximately $4.9 million within the time frame we've been talking about.
So now part of that program involves the monitoring of Runit Dome. Your department 2020 report indicated routine preventative maintenance is necessary. Can you describe the steps the department takes to maintain the integrity of the dome?
Yes, we do visual inspections. During our mission in 2013, we noticed superficial cracks. Those cracks were cleaned out, obviously, chased out, and epoxy cement applied. We have hired local individuals, local marshallese to inspect the dome on a periodic basis. And then we have formal inspections on a 4-year basis as we are required to provide.
One last question. The Department of Interior provided your department with $1.6 million to improve groundwater analysis capabilities. How does the Department of Energy plan to use this funding to create an improved monitoring system around the Runit Dome? I mean, we see, countless opportunities within the mining industry that utilizes, liners with security and sensors. How can that be applied, and is it being even considered?
The gentleman's time has expired, but the witness may briefly respond.
We will be using that fund to apply boreholes into the dome as well as in the surrounding area. Those boreholes will allow sampling at multiple heights, which will give us a much better insight into exactly what is happening with the dome. So we'll be using the funds for that. We have a drill rig. We have gone out to seek the we asked for a bid from the drilling organizations in order to do that work. We have procured the drilling platform and have evaluated the dome integrity, ensure it can support the weight of the drilling platform. We have installed sensors into the existing boreholes to monitor water level, and that is how we have determined that the dome is actually communicating with the lagoon and the ocean as the tide rises and falls.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry for that technical difficulty. Ranking member and the witnesses, of course, joining us today. Earlier this year, this committee held a hearing on the long-lasting impacts of U.S. military testing on the island of Vieques, another injustice at the hands of our government. Like Vieques, the Marshall Islands served as a toxic testing ground, all at the expense of the people living there. And like Vieques, the Marshall Islands is marked by higher rates of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and other illnesses even decades after exposure. The U.S. ruined their food supply, and after promising free health care, we yanked it away in the mid-1990s welfare reform deal. That's a lot of history to answer for, but now the Marshall Islands face a new crisis. Climate change is forcing its people to relocate and threatening Runit Dome or the tomb. Make no mistake, our country is entirely responsible for our nuclear testing and related cancer rates. Like Vieques in Puerto Rico, this is a shameful part of our colonial history and legacy, and it's time to do the right thing. I'm disappointed that a representative from the State Department declined to join us today, so I'll address my questions to Mr. Maury from the Department of Energy. Mr. Maury, in your testimony, you mentioned that, quote, additional work is necessary to complete groundwater monitoring at Runit Dome and that it was delayed due to the pandemic. Can you provide an update on the status of the work necessary to complete the groundwater monitoring effort?
Yes, as I mentioned, we have gone out with a request for proposal for drilling organizations to actually do the drilling into the Runit Dome. We will have to provide the logistics necessary to get the equipment to the Runit Dome, the mission, coordinate with the local marshallese, make sure that we are in full compliance or full agreement on the path forward. It will require us to determine what we are going to do with the waste products as we drill into the Runit Dome. And we will establish those monitoring wells. Those monitoring wells are going to be critical for us to have a much better technically defensible, scientifically defensible understanding of exactly what is going on inside the Runit Dome and how it is interacting with the environment.
And thank you. And last year, the DOE report found that Runit Dome is sound and that radioactive leakage into the nearby lagoon is not significant. The DOE further insinuated that the U.S. is absolved of any responsibility for the tomb. Meanwhile, Marshallese leaders claim that DOE has downplayed the risk and declined to take responsibility for the dome and its leaking contents. In your view, is the U.S. responsible for addressing the concerns of the people of the Marshall Islands?
I really can't make a statement on what the U.S. government has determined as who is responsible for the Runit Dome. I would characterize DOE's efforts as we are the implementer of Congress's will, as well as those laws that require us to do our health monitoring as well as our monitoring of the dome. Right now, when you made the statement that it is not causing a significant impact on the local environment, that's based on our limited sampling in the boreholes that were established by the National Academy of Science. And we're unable to determine exactly what that impact is. If you look at the comparison between the dome, what's going on in the lagoon, dome contains approximately less than 1% of the radioactive material in comparison to the lagoon. So it makes it very difficult to determine without more detailed analysis that we will get from this radiochemistry analysis exactly what's occurring.
And when do you anticipate that those studies will be complete?
Garcia, it appears that our witness has left the hearing. I will allow you to pose your question to him again and return your time if he's able to rejoin. In the meantime, you are welcome to direct your question to Mr. Pula if you have one while we work to get Mr. Mori back engaged in this hearing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back at this point.
Madam Chair, if I may, Sablan here. If Mr. Mori does return, can you ask him to improve his microphone? Because it's very difficult to hear what he's saying, not just that he's really taking his time to answer his questions.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, I will, Mr. Sablan. Mr. Mori, have you rejoined us?
Yes, I apologize.
Okay.
I apologize for that. That was a technical error on my behalf.
Mr. Mori, we would like to ask you to please scoot closer to your camera and please speak directly into the microphone so that
Sure,
we can
you're right.
hear and see you better.
Yeah, I apologize. If you would like, I can finish the question on our time
Yes,
frame.
we would like you to please
Yes.
respond to Mr. Garcia.
Our plan, I mean, obviously, there are a lot of variables associated with what's happening in the world with COVID and travel restrictions, but our intent is in the 2022 timeframe to be doing this work. So that is our goal, and that is what we are shooting for. And hope that answers your
Any
question.
remaining questions?
No, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Recognizes Ms. Radewagen, the gentlelady from the American Samoa, for her questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Porter and Ranking Member Gosar, for holding today's hearing. The Marshall Islands are dear to my heart and like a second home to me. Former President Amate Kabua was close to my father and was like an uncle to me, and his mother Dorothy named my sister Limanman. So it's a personal as well as official concern when U.S. officials insist known legal claims settled in 1986 mean we can wash our hands of the nuclear test legacy. I wish State Department was here today to be reminded of U.S. obligations under the 1986 Settlement for Cooperation and Justice based on human needs and harm not fully understood back in 1986. Marshallese people love America. They fight for freedom around the world on active duty in our armed forces. They don't hate us for harm done, but they know what we promised. So as we study new information not known or disclosed in 1986, let's not turn our back on a nation hosting absolutely vital national security capabilities. Let's not force RMI to consider lucrative offers for new regional economic and diplomatic realignment. Let's stop pushing our friends into the arms of our competitors. Finally, the impact the Runit Dome has had on surrounding ecology and health of the local population is not insignificant. Let's not ignore our obligation as a Natural Resources Committee to the environment, and on a more basic level, our obligation to the Marshallese as fellow humans. We all have the shared goal of fostering a healthy relationship between man and nature. Mr. Mori, last year, the Marshall Islands government raised concerns about the science in your Runit Dome report. On the issue of a lack of peer review, your office responded that, quote, DOE is focused on transparency, sharing data when it becomes available, and submitting results for publication in peer-reviewed journals, quote. Now, while DOE's response in this case is all well and good, multiple reports from almost 70 years ago still remain secret, and we've already heard about ways DOE's predecessor agencies misled and harmed the Marshallese people. You can understand why there is still a trust deficit with your office. Will you commit to submitting the Runit Dome for peer review and making the findings public? It's a yes or no question.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Murray.
Yes. Yes.
And when you come into compliance with the Insular Areas Act of 2011, will you commit to submitting groundwater tests for peer review?
Yes.
Thank you. My second question is for Director Pula. My understanding is that the Section 177 agreement is a full and final agreement as to legal liability lawsuits that ends U.S. court jurisdiction as to the specific claims covered by the settlement. But I also understand the full and final terms do not prevent additional compensation. For example, after the settlement took effect in 1986, the U.S. agreed in 1988 to pay the people of Bikini an additional $90 million for resettlement to end another lawsuit. And in 1991, the U.S. paid an additional $45 million to the people of Rongeland. Then there is the changed circumstances provision for newly discovered damage or injury to people. So, does the full and final terms as to lawsuits prevent the RMI from proposing additional compensation and the U.S. agreeing in mutually approved terms to additional compensation, station, or assistance without reopening the claims covered by the full and final settlement? Mr. Pula?
You, Madam Member Radawakin. The question is direct, but it's complicated. To the extent that its full and final settlement refers back to 1986. However, there have been, as you mentioned, ex gratia payments that was authorized by Congress and appropriated for later after the Section 177. So that's why basically it's a sensitive matter and it involves other agencies, including, in the State Department or even Justice Department. So I would defer to those departments on that matter. But as far as the Department of Interior is concerned, we execute whatever Congress asks us to do.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Oh, just in closing, I'd like to ask to submit 2 articles for the record. One is about the Marshall Islands and how it became a fishery superpower, and the other one is along those same lines. Madam Chairwoman.
So ordered. Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan, for his questioning. Mr. Sablan, I believe you need to unmute. We're not going to start the timer until you're on. Are you able to unmute?
Yes, I am, Madam Chair. Thank you. Again, Madam Chair, thank you for this hearing. Mr. Gosar, thank you for holding this hearing. And I want to welcome all our witnesses, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the gentle lady who I understand resides in Arkansas. I want to also express my condolences for this horrible suffering that the people, the Marshallese people had in COVID when they were COVID first experienced. I know that a large part of the population throughout the country experienced COVID. I'm going to ask my questions. First to Mr. Mori, Secretary Mori. You say that pursuant to the terms of the Compact of Free Association, the Republic of the Marshall Islands bears full responsibility for maintaining and monitoring the Dome and Runit Island. What provision of the compact says that?
Sir, with your permission, I'd like to take that for the record. I don't know that off the top of my head.
That was your statement, Mr. Murray.
I'm sorry, you didn't hear me?
No, I said, but that's what you say. So my question is, what part of the compact says that?
I do not know off the top of my head. I don't have that information.
Well, okay, so who's the original source of the information on which you base your assertion that the Marshall Islands bears full responsibility for maintaining the Dome and the Runit Island
That is a historical information that has been provided to me as the implementer of these programs.
Do they work for the State Department, may I ask?
I do not know the answer to that question, sir.
All right. I'm going to turn to Mr. Pula. Well, Nick, Mr. Pula, welcome back to the committee. You also testified that Section 177 of the RMI Compact included a full settlement of all claims, past, present, and future, arising from or in any way related to the U.S. testing program, end quote. That, of course, refers to legal claims. It does not mean that the Marshallese people cannot request additional measures warranted by consequences of the United States using the islands while they were a territory and ministered in trust for the UN, for U.S. For nuclear test purposes. You yourself also told the subcommittee that Section 105C2 of the laws that approved, added to, and effectively modified the compact authorized appropriations for health and education as a result of exceptional circumstances and ex gratia contributions for the populations of Bikini and Ewetak, Langelap, and Utirik. So the United States also, however, promised in Article 9 of the agreement under Section 177 that the Marshall Islands may request additional compensation for losses or injuries caused by or related to U.S. nuclear bomb testing that could not reasonably be identified at the time of the 177 agreement 35 years ago, and that the U.S. would duly consider such requests, Nick?
I agree with the statement by Member Sablan in terms of Section 177. That's the law that was approved by Congress that has that language that refers to that. However, as some have mentioned, or including perhaps in my testimony, even after that, there are two things that we need to remember. One is that there is a changed circumstances that also kind of follows the Section 177 of the full and final settlement. And then Congress, in its decision-making, also provided more assistance after 1986 to some of these
Yeah.
atolls.
Um,
And therefore, that's ex question. And I just want to make mention, and those things are both in the Congress that they approve, and as we execute the laws, and that's what we do.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pula. Madam Chair, I will have questions to submit for the record, but I just want to say this, if I last words, because despite what Mr. Pula said, no negotiating sessions last year at a principal or technical level. This is for the renewal of the compact agreement. There's no discussion of a meeting in the next couple of weeks or at any time planned. There were meetings preliminary to the negotiations on current compact issues and on a confidentiality proposal from the U.S. last year that would have prevented the Republic of the Marshall Islands from talking to Congress or the other freely associated states. Never a negotiating session on issues, and the State and Interior has not agreed to the Republic of Marshall Islands request to discuss the scope and agenda for the motivation. So I just would like to put that into the record, and I will submit additional questions. Thank you, QFRs. Madam Chair, thank you very much for allowing me to sit in with this hearing. I will be jumping back and forth between the markup, but I'm very grateful that we had this hearing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Sablan. And we may be able to accommodate a second round of questioning if you're able to rejoin us.
Yes.
I appreciate your comments at the close of your questioning, and I hope to be able to return and direct those in the form of questions to our witnesses. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Moore, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Porter, Ranking Member Gosar. To our witnesses, thanks for carving out some time today to be here, and I join with others on the committee in appreciating to do this. So thanks for being here. I can't understate how important this region is to geostrategic importance, for the United States to counter China's ever-expanding influence. I've lived in Southeast Asia. I know it's very different from the Marshall Islands. I spent time in Singapore, living, within the South China Sea area. It's a constant focus of mine. It's constantly, even when in preparing for this briefing, this is what the conversations led to in my team. I serve on the Armed Services Committee, countering China's ever-growing influence with the malfeasance and the approach in their human rights record. I mean, we have to keep that at the focus of what we're doing. And so I appreciate and I respect this partnership with Marshall Islands for that reason, and as this sort of driving force is very important. My questions will be brief, but primarily for Mr. Mori. You pointed out in your testimony that the department is continually monitoring activities associated with DOE Marshall Islands program. Let me just broadly ask, is there anything that makes it difficult for the department to conduct this monitoring?
Some of the challenges obviously are associated with communications between the Marshallese, making sure that they understand what we're talking about. The logistics associated with being 2,500 miles from Honolulu make it difficult. But other than that, we have been as active as possible and working closely with both the citizens and the RMI government to ensure that we are fulfilling our requirements.
Can you add any more context on how the department goes about monitoring the Runit Dome for leakage in particular?
Yes, well, We really can't monitor it for leakage through the groundwater underneath the dome. I mean, that's the whole purpose of our upcoming drilling effort. So what we do know is based on level measurements that we've installed in the existing boreholes that were established by the National Academy of Science, is that as the tide goes up in the lagoon and in the ocean on the other side, that we do see a corresponding increase and decrease within the dome structure itself. So that is how we are monitoring to determine what is happening. But as far as the actual contents and what is actually leaking or not leaking out of the dome, a more sophisticated process will be required, and that's what we are planning and pursuing here in the coming year.
That's actually what I would bring up too, as I kind of throw out one last question. Across the board, we're constantly seeing technological innovations that making it possible for us to simultaneously increase efficiency and reduce costs. We see it across the board in virtually all of our industries, our energy industry, you name it, right? Anything in particular that you'd like to share that you could provide for us some more context on what you're pursuing, what the department is pursuing, that makes it easier, quicker, more cost effective to fulfill its obligations under the DOE Marshall Islands program?
Well, just one that people are very familiar with is our latest visual monitoring of the dome itself was done by a programmed unmanned aerial vehicle and actually flew the dome. If you do go to the Livermore website, you can actually see that dome in act, or that UAS in action. So that's one of the technologies. It's a simple technology, but it has greatly enhanced our ability to visually monitor the condition of the dome and be able to compare it on a periodic basis each time we do that monitoring. As far as there's constant improvements in radiochemistry analysis. We're fortunate we have Livermore involved in this, and they have access to obviously our national labs, which are the premier entities for conducting these types of analysis.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Case.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Maury, I am reading from the Department of Energy's June 2020 report on Runit Dome, and I'm just going to quote here. The main risk posed by the dome will be derived from the flow of contaminated groundwater from beneath the containment structure into the local marine environment. To date, there is no data to suggest that the dome, or more specifically, the radioactive material encapsulated there, is currently having a measurable adverse effect on the surrounding environment. I'm unclear from this. Is there in fact leakage from the dome into the groundwater underneath it that you have determined that thus far that leakage does not produce any harmful measurable impact, or is there no leakage from the dome and that is residual groundwater underneath the dome from prior radioactive exposure, or do you not know? Which of those three is it?
Well, I think what we have to assume is based on the linkage between, the tide rising, the tide going down, and what we're seeing with levels inside the dome, that there is some leakage occurring with the dome. How much, we don't know.
Okay, so your working assumption is it is leaking because you do detect some radioactive exposure. You're just saying that as a matter of scale, it's not at the level that you consider to be a concern at the moment. Is that right?
I would say part of the problem is that the level in the lagoons is not changing. So
okay, so
if there is leakage coming out of Runit Dome, contaminated leakage coming out of Runit Dome and going into the lagoon, it's being masked. And it's
Okay, and
been-
you are saying that you have concluded that basically your monitoring regime is not adequate to really fully answer the questions that I'm asking, and you want to step that up, and you want to accelerate and implement your groundwater radioactive analysis program, right? And the 2 boreholes that you tried were not sufficient for that, and so you have to ramp it up. Is that right?
That is correct, and that's why we have been working with the Department of Interior and why they have been agreeable and provided us additional funding to put that program in place.
Okay, and here's an observation from me. It doesn't feel like this is a priority. Like I would be, if I was uncertain as to whether and to what extent there was in fact leakage into the underlying groundwater and that dispersing out into the broader environment, that would be top of mind. I see in your report that you have various reasons for why you haven't been able to pull it off, including mobilization, but in all honesty, I struggle to understand why you can't overcome the logistical concerns, given the possibility that there is, in fact, a substantial level of leakage that we just haven't detected yet. I mean, you've got Kwajalein right there. You've got, I assume we can cut through the COVID-19, restrictions at this point. You appear to have funding. How do you accelerate this so that we can actually just get some scientific answers to determine what to do next?
Well, I don't want to give the impression that this is not one of our highest priorities, because we have people working on this all the time. The COVID restrictions are real. I mean, they have been established to protect the citizens of the Republic of Marshall Islands, and we respect that, and so we have not been able to get out to the island.
How many people do you need to actually go out there and test?
A lot's going to depend on what we get back. Well, to test or to do our drilling program. I mean, there's no real way to just test and drop a borehole into the ground. It's going to take a drilling process to get them down.
I do understand that. So I'm not downplaying the logistical challenges of mobilizing in the Pacific. I was just on Wake Island a few weeks ago and got that in spades. But as my time is expiring, I would invite the folks that do actually represent the Marshall Islands to comment on how we accelerate and remove any restrictions on getting these tests in place in the event that the United States feels that there is any complications in terms of getting the 2 governments to agree on how to deal with COVID-19 and other logistical challenges. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we would welcome that.
Thank you very much. As we close out panel 1, I would just like to invite Director Pula and Mr. Mori, if there are any statements or comments that you have made during your testimony that you believe need to be corrected with regard to the negotiations, the number of meetings that have been held, for example, between the United States and the Marshall Islands, you are able to submit corrections to the record in the upcoming few days, and I encourage you both to consider doing so if you believe it is appropriate. With that, we are going to move on to our second panel. As with the first panel, oral statements are going to be limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the record. You're going to see a timer begin when you start. It will turn orange when there is 1 minute remaining and will turn red when your time has expired. After the witnesses have testified, members are going to be given the opportunity to ask questions. Our first witness is the Honorable Kasten Nemra, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Kasten Nemra to testify.
Thank you, Madam Chair Porter, Ranking Member Kozar, and members of this committee. On behalf of President David Kabua, the government and people of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, it is indeed my great honor and privilege to testify before you here today, virtually from Majuro Atoll, the capital of the Marshall Islands. I would also note that today marks the 35th anniversary of the Compact of Free Association between our 2 respective countries, which became effective on October 21st of 1986. This is a story of promises and commitments made, but not kept. I want to begin my testimony today with the statement from late President Harry S. Truman on November 25th of 1947 and presented to the United Nations Security Council that were concerned about the people of Eniwetok who were being removed and relocated so that the U.S. could conduct its nuclear weapon testing. President Truman, quote, "The Eniwetakis will be accorded all rights which are the normal constitutional rights of the citizen under the Constitution, but will be dealt with as wards of the United States for whom this country has special responsibilities," unquote. The U.S. detonated a total of 67 thermonuclear atmospheric tests on Eniwetok and Bikini atolls here in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. This was equivalent to detonation of 1.7 Hiroshima bombs every day for 12 years. The devastating consequences of the horrible legacy continue this day, sadly, as outlined in my written statement. The Compact of Pre-Association provided a structure and framework to settle claims the people and government of the Marshall Islands arise as a result of the U.S. nuclear testing program. As noted, Section 177 of the Compact provides, I quote, "The government of the United States accept the responsibility for compensation owing to citizens of the Marshall Islands for claiming arising out of the nuclear testing program," unquote. The Section 177 agreement further provided for a $150 million nuclear claims fund that was to pay out amounts for specific purposes, including creating a claims tribunal to make final determinations of the compensation owed to claimants. The last payment of any tribunal awards was made in 2008. There's no funding available anymore to compensate for the unpaid awards, continue radiation-related health care, or engage in any other activity to address the consequences of the U.S. nuclear testing program. The basic and a fundamental reason why that the nuclear claims fund of the 150 never produced the 18 million in perpetuity as assigned back when the negotiated was agreed. This was due to the flawed and unrealistic expected investment, the return of 12% per annum. The Marshall Islands has pursued remedies available to it under Section 177 agreement, including the change circumstance provision. Our government filed a petition in September 2000 outlining the reason why it exists. The State Department's response, however, to the petition was largely insist that the circumstances do not exist because they even took place before the 177 agreement and were thus known by the parties. Even though most of the information, the test was still classified and largely unknown at the time the Section 177 agreement became effective. We now know, Madam Chair, the tremendous amount of more related poisonous remains to the U.S. weapon testing at Eniwetok than we did even know in 2000, when the Army filed the change circumstance petition. The U.S. shipped radioactive waste from Nevada and dumped in Eniwetok, including remnants of chemical and biological weapons. Sea level rise is causing radioactive materials to leak into the lagoon to the faulty and cost-cutting construction of the dome. The radioactive waste was buried in the lagoon and spilled into NJB Island, and that 99% of the plutonium actually is not under the dome. And the U.S. Department of Energy has never produced the required report on the dome and its environment. Cancer has also increased substantially, while the current 177 for atoll healthcare program only has enough money to collect data and provide minimum healthcare. I take this opportunity and thank Chairman Chris Jalfa of the full committee for proposing and obtaining committee approval of legislation to require a more fulsome report regarding the Runit Dome and its surrounding environment. And thank you, Madam Chair Porter, for leading the House in approving that legislation, the National Defense Authorization Act FY22, and also the leading the House in passing a provision of that bill, which would require the classification of all documents related to U.S. nuclear weapon program testing in the Marshall Islands. With explanation to Congress of any material not released, it is important that this includes redacted information. Unkept promises and unfulfilled commitments. The U.S. has no closer association with the Marshall Islands. We have been given the U.S. authority to exercise two of the most fundamental aspects of our national sovereignty to protect U.S. security: ultimate control of our border, which cover an expanse of the Pacific as large as United States east of Mississippi, and our interaction with other nations. Our young men and women serve the U.S. Armed Forces at rates higher than most states. We host what the Joint Chief of Staff has categorized as, quote, the world premier range for intercontinental ballistic missiles testing and space operation support, unquote. We remain consistently one with the United States and strongest allies in the UN. The RMI has maintained its commitment and always will do so with the United States. Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity, and I ask the U.S. Congress to kindly address full range of nuclear legacy issues outstanding through legislation. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes, we're going to hear testimony from Mr. Dean Cheng, who is a senior research fellow at the Asian Studies Center at the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. So the chair would now like to recognize Mr. Cheng to testify.
Good morning, Chair Porter, Ranking Member Gosar, representatives. My name is Dean Cheng. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Chinese Political and Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. My comments this morning are my own. My comments this morning are intended to provide some context for better understanding the importance of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to American security, especially in light of Chinese strategic developments. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is important in at least three key ways relative to ongoing strategic competition with the PRC: as a site for U.S. missile and missile defense testing, as an essential part of U.S. space surveillance capabilities, and because of its strategic location in the second island chain. You have already heard comments from the previous panel and the previous speaker regarding the Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense Test Site. This is a site for U.S. ICBM tests. This is of increasing importance given the aging of the American Minuteman III, one of the key legs of our nuclear triad, and will be essential for next generation ICBM testing. The distance of the Marshall Islands from the United States provides us with a better sense of flight profiles, gives us a better sense of how the image of a warhead changes over time, the warhead in space. Notably speaking, future U.S. hypersonic weapons developments are also likely to be tested here, and this is absolutely essential for countering Chinese and Russian hypersonic developments, some of which have been in the news recently. In addition, it is a site for U.S. missile defense tests, which in turn is vital for helping to defend the United States against growing ICBM threats from the People's Republic of China, from North Korea, as well as Russia, and possibly even from Iran. With regards to space surveillance, space is seen as a key strategic battleground of the future. Chinese military writings by the People's Liberation Army indicate that they expect to attack enemy space systems early in a conflict as part of both achieving space dominance and leading subsequently to information dominance, which the PLA sees as essential for fighting and winning future wars. The PLA itself has been testing a variety of counter space elements, which include direct descent systems designed to attack satellites in both low Earth orbit and geosynchronous orbit. They have also been working on co-orbital anti-satellite systems. In order to counter this, it is essential to be able to maintain what is termed space situational awareness, basically the ability to monitor and track items in space. On Kwajalein Island has been installed the space fence. This provides essential ability to monitor objects in space. It is considered the world's most advanced space surveillance radar. This is important not only in wartime, but also in peacetime, because there have been growing numbers of space collisions. Most recently, one involving, ironically enough, a Chinese weather satellite, Ringhai 1-02, which apparently collided with a piece of a Russian booster. A major difference between the United States and PRC in this regard is that most Chinese facilities are in China, whereas the United States, having the opportunity to work with nations such as the Republic of the Marshall Islands, we can obtain greater depth for space early warning and monitoring. And as with so much in defense, knowing something early is a vital strategic advantage. This leads us to the third factor, which is the fact that the Republic of the Marshall Islands is part of the so-called second island chain. The second island chain is of growing importance because of the Chinese ability to now hold the first island chain at overwhelming risk. The first island chain extends from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines. China can cover that entire region through a variety of systems, including UAVs, air-breathing aircraft, a variety of missiles, sub and ship-launched cruise missiles. So it is therefore of vital importance to have fallback positions that are harder to reach. It is not possible to simply rely on the American territory of Guam, which is already overcrowded and is therefore an exceedingly high-value target. Central Pacific Islands therefore play a growing role in American defense thinking and planning. It should also be noted that the Republic of the Marshall Islands, along with several other Pacific Island states, are some of Taiwan's last diplomatic partners. Let me conclude by noting some of the vital policy issues that arise. It is essential to negotiate a successor agreement to the Compact of Free Association. But beyond the military aspects, we need to be thinking about economic and political partnerships, countering Chinese investment efforts in the region, countering Chinese fishing activities, which someone noted that the Republic of the Marshall Islands is a fishing superpower. If so, it is extraordinarily vulnerable to China's 17,000 fishing boats, one of which actually at one point ran aground on one of the islands in the Marshalls, and working with other U.S. allies, including Australia, New Zealand, potentially the UK, Japan, and also working with Taiwan to encourage Central Pacific states to both retain Taiwanese diplomatic recognition, but as important, working together for an integrated regional approach and strategy. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this morning.
Thank you very much. The chair would now like to recognize Congressman Womack. Are you available? Are you here?
I am.
Wonderful. We'd like to recognize you for 2 minutes to introduce Ms. Melissa Leyland, the founder and executive director of the Arkansas Coalition of the Marshallese, as our next witness.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and Ranking Member Gosar. Thank you for having me today to introduce my distinguished constituent, Melissa Leyland. Melissa lives in Springdale, Arkansas, and is the founder and executive director of the Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese. The coalition advocates on behalf of more than 15,000 Marshallese who live in Arkansas and the surrounding areas. She is a Marshall Islands native and a veteran of the United States Army. Thank you, Melissa, for your service. She has served on the Arkansas Minority Health Commission, becoming the first Marshall Islanders to sit on an Arkansas State Commission, and is a certified interpreter. She's led the charge at the state level to ensure our local policies reflect the unique status of the Marshallese community. As the committee members may know, among other things, the Compact of Free Association between the U.S. and the Republic of the Marshall Islands allows eligible Marshallese to live in the United States with a status similar to lawful permanent residents. Melissa has also been at the forefront of efforts to ensure federal policies reflect the agreed-to Compacts of Free Association. I've worked alongside her, Representative Case, and other members with populations affected by a technical mistake with the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act to restore Medicaid benefits to freely associated state citizens living in the U.S. I'm proud to say our advocacy secured a fix that is helping our Marshallese residents as we speak. I will continue working with Melissa, the Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese, and Representative Case on the Compact Impact Fairness Act to solve other challenges once and for all. I want to thank the committee for inviting Melissa to be a witness today. I believe she has an important perspective to share with you. She epitomizes the values of hard work and service to others that are the hallmark of our Northwest Arkansas community. Marshallese families are an integral part of the Northwest Arkansas community. Across the nation, COFA citizens support U.S. defense efforts, pay taxes, and are core elements of our economy and our communities. With that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back the balance of my time and welcome, as our witness, Melissa Leyland, Springdale, Arkansas.
Very much, Mr. Womack. Ms. Leyland, you are now recognized to testify.
Thank you so much, Representative Steve Womack, for the great introduction. Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to offer thoughts on the Runit Dome and the U.S. Nuclear Legacy in the Marshall Islands. I am the Executive Director for the Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese, responsible for the overall operation of the organization. One of my roles as the lead of the organization is to understand and address the well-being, strengths, and the challenges that the Marshallese community faces in Arkansas. I'm also a U.S. military veteran who proudly served during the Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. Being part of the strongest security force that protects the Marshall Islands and the other freely associated countries was the greatest accomplishment I pursued as a young woman. At no time did I ever question my decision to be part of the U.S. military because I was taught to think of the Americans as our friends, allies, and families. This unique friendship through the Compact of Free Association outlines the mutual symbiotic relationship between the United States of America and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which permits Marshallese and the other Compact of Free Association citizens to travel to the United States without any need for COFA or limitation of stay. American citizens are also afforded the same visitation freedom to the COFA nations. It was later in my military career that I came to learn and better understand the crucial role of the Marshall Islands to the U.S. national security and the rest of the free world. The Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense Test Site located on Kwajalein Atoll is a strategic site used to test cutting-edge radar systems, develop missile interceptors, and advanced space surveillance and satellite tracking, all of which provide defensive security shields to the United States from foreign powers. A vast body of the ocean is controlled by the United States for military purposes. The rate of enlistment and representation of Marshall Islanders and other COFA Islanders to the United States military per capita is higher than many U.S. states, affirming the sacrifice the small island nation's sons and daughters contribute to the U.S. security and the security of the free world. The people of the Marshall Islands continue to provide their land, their ocean, and their people for the protection of the United States. The perilous impact of the U.S. nuclear testing operations post-World War II has come at tremendous cost to the citizens of the Marshall Islands and has left permanent scars physically, environmentally, mentally, and historically. The ramification has caused massive damages resulting in intergenerational trauma, heightened fear, and increased mistrust within the Marshallese community of U.S. involvement and intentions. I live with these folks in the Ozark Mountain of Northwest Arkansas, and many are direct descendants of nuclear victims who have shared their personal stories of displacement and how their nuclear legacy has impacted their homes, food supplies, and their everyday lives. These victims and these families had to relearn how to survive on different islands, and generations later, many are still looking for a permanent home. It is only right and imperative that the United States should examine and seriously evaluate the need for a relocation program for the affected islanders. This should be dealt as a priority and should acknowledge that the pathway to naturalization and citizenship should also be part of the relocation plan. We are engulfed with complicated immigration issues that seem simple on the surface, yet the root cause is much more complex due to compliance protocols that comes with programs such as the e-verification that the United States put into its administrative policies. These practices are not coherent and contradict the purpose of the Compact of Free Association. They are designed to address the general immigration classification, but fail to address the migrant with non-immigrant status as it relates to the Marshallese and other COFA Islanders. One example of this issue is the replacement of the I-94 form. This is an issue that almost cost a livelihood of a hardworking single mother like Stephanie Takamura, who incurred a medical bill of $200,000. She was informed that her I-94 did not match her passport, and without the replacement, she wouldn't be able to apply for Medicaid. These irregularities in policies thus isolate the community and disconnect the people from access to resources, including housing, employment, healthcare, and other simple things, just as getting a driver's license and renewing their identification cards. It was only through the reality of the COVID-19 pandemic and the inherent difficulties of challenges that the U.S. government realized that the need to restore Medicaid program was necessary. In fact, the Medicaid program was part of the Compact of Free Association, should have never been taken away from the COFA citizens. We are 25 years too late to help community members like Lisa, who is battling a thyroid tumor cases for many years. Like many other Marshallese, Lisa's medical bill of $21,000 has caused her to pay higher interest rates. People with similar situations like Lisa's will never have a chance to reach their full potential economics. Thank you so much, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ms. Leyland. We would now like to introduce Ms. Ray Moss-Christian. She is the chair of the Marshall Islands National Nuclear Commission, and we'd like to recognize you for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Porter, Ranking Member Gosar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to testify before you as the chair of the National Nuclear Commission and as a Marshallese American addressing outstanding U.S. nuclear testing issues in the Marshall Islands. I carry the trauma of the nuclear tests through my late mother, who, like many Marshallese people, was downwind of the Castle Bravo test at Bikini Atoll when she was a young girl. She was exposed to radiation, but her community was not evacuated, nor were other mid-range atolls that were also exposed. Through my mother's absence and the experience that she shared with me, I continue to learn both about the scope and the extent of damages caused by that memorable bomb test on March 1st, 1954, and the other 66 nuclear weapon detonations. I am among the new generation of Marshallese representatives, speaking to a new generation of U.S. lawmakers and a new generation of global politics, discussing the impact that the U.S. nuclear weapons testing program in the Marshall Islands, that ended more than 6 decades ago, still has on our lives. We need action. I am here to state the case for action and for a fuller measure of cooperation, trust, and justice than has characterized the past 3/4 of a century. My testimony today is a continuation of past testimonies by Marshallese leaders from Bikini, Eniwetok, Rongelap, and Utrecht atolls, whose communities experienced the brunt of the harm from the nuclear tests. I would like to submit links to some of those past testimonies for the record of this hearing, as they clearly outlined the scope of damages to our islands and to our health. The U.S. nuclear testing program aimed to enhance the security of the United States and its allies, but it continues to create insecurity for people in the Marshall Islands. Many of our islands remain unsafe for resettlement and are in need of remediation. People are facing health challenges that we are ill-equipped to address. And we are at risk of our future generations, like my daughters, not having the knowledge about this part of their history that they'll need to address the problems they will inherit. These are intergenerational challenges that our leaders have been asking Congress to address for decades. A 2004 report by the U.S. National Cancer Institute estimated that an additional 500 cancer cases would emerge among Marshallese people exposed during the testing period, representing about 3.6% of the population at the time. That is a huge number in our small country. In proportional terms, It is as if fallout had created 6 million additional cancers in the United States. It is critical to note for this subcommittee that the U.S. federal government's principal agency for cancer research determines in excess of 500 cancers due to U.S. nuclear testing. We desperately need the oversight and investigation of DOE to address the fact that there is no cancer care facility or even an oncologist in the Marshall Islands today. The burden to care for these 500 cancers is on the Marshall Islands government and the families. Patients have to leave the country to receive care, or they have no chance for treatment or survival. With respect to the environment, we acknowledge and appreciate the work that DOE has carried out over the years, but we are still missing critical information about the scale of U.S. activities in our islands. An example of this is with the resettled Inuiatak community that is continuously told that the nearby Runit Dome poses no threat to their livelihoods. Yet some critical information was only recently revealed, or in some cases remains classified, such as the reports about biological and chemical weapons testing. I implore the subcommittee to help rectify this situation, starting with soliciting input from the Inuiatak community, as well as independent scientists, as the RMI does not have the ability to change the way DOE operates in our country. We ask that this subcommittee consider conducting virtual field hearings for different atoll communities in the Marshall Islands to provide opportunities for dialogue and shared action. Through this subcommittee's efforts, there is a chance for progress, but this requires the U.S. government to acknowledge the full scope of damages and injuries. People are entitled to payment of their awards from the Nuclear Claims Tribunal, and others deserve a chance to have their claims heard. The Runit Dome and all that it represents about radiation still present in our environment requires a bilateral re-examination of DOE's role and programs in the RMI. People deserve a U.S. standard of healthcare to treat illnesses linked to U.S. activities on our islands. And people need the opportunity to participate and contribute to research that seeks to enhance our understanding of how radiation is impacting our lives and livelihoods. Allow me to conclude by saying that the Marshall Islands government established the Nuclear Commission in 2017 and adopted a nuclear justice strategy in 2019 because it recognized the challenges we continue to face in addressing the legacy of U.S. nuclear testing. As the chair of the National Nuclear Commission, let me assure you that we stand ready to do our part to create the fuller measure of cooperation with the DOE and the rest of the U.S. government that is required for the tasks ahead. Reciprocity is, of course, essential. Thank you, Chairwoman Porter, Ranking Member Gosar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for your time.
Thank you very much. I thank the entire panel for their testimony. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions that they wish to ask the witnesses. I will begin. Ms. Moss-Christian, to your knowledge, has the United States ever made a formal apology to the Marshallese people for the nuclear testing program?
Not to my knowledge, no.
As a daughter of a victim of the U.S. nuclear testing program, what would it mean to you for the what would it mean to you if the United States were to make such an apology?
Well, I think an apology is a pathway. It's a start for healing to begin. It's a way for Marshallese to be recognized for the harms that took place, and maybe for a new dialogue to take place that where the services that are needed so badly can be delivered. But I think the apology is a place to start that conversation.
Ms. Leyland, are you aware of the United States making any apology to the people of the Marshall Islands and the Republic of the Marshall Islands for its nuclear testing program?
Not that I'm aware of.
Has the United States apologized for the 15 years in which it denied the Marshallese people access to Medicaid, which it promised to give them under COFA?
25 years, madam. Not that I'm aware of.
Ms. Leyland, as a U.S. Army veteran and a leader in the Marshallese community, what would it mean to you and your family and your community if the United States were to make a formal apology?
I think it will say a lot. It will say a lot to all of us. It will mean that the United States is willing to work with the people.
I find it interesting that in the testimony from some of our panel one witnesses, for example, Mr. Mori from the Department of Energy, he said in his testimony that the United States has recognized the effects of its testing and has accepted and acted on its responsibility to the people of the Marshall Islands. It's very hard for me to understand how we have recognized what we have done with this testing and how we have accepted and acted on responsibility if we haven't even issued an apology. And I agree with both of you that this apology is not enough, but it is a necessary and missing first step. And particularly an apology at this point would come at a very, very important time as our countries try to find ways to continue our important relationship. I'm now going to turn to Mr. Gosar for his questioning.
I thank the gentlelady, and to the gentlelady's point, I mean, we have issues about this very same process in regards to the RICA settlement and the administrative violation against southeastern Clark County and northwestern Mojave County in the downwinders dispute. So, I mean, this is something that needs to be drawn to attention. So from that standpoint, you have my support and agreement there. Mr. Chang, thank you for testifying before the subcommittee today. I look forward to discussing the important role the Marshall Islands play in the United States defense planning. Can you explain why the Marshall Islands are considered strategically advantageous of a position for the United States to have a presence?
So the islands sit astride are literally in the Central Pacific, of course, which means that they sit astride the key sea lanes that link the west coast of the United States with the factories and industries of East Asia. The radars that are located on Kwajalein provide us with vital ability to observe space, to see objects as small as marbles. Given the speed at which things move in space, even something as small as flecks of paint have been known to damage the space shuttle and the International Space Station. And finally, those radars also provide a vital capacity to track American missile tests and also provide us with some measure of, again, missile-related early warning as well as space-related early warning.
Well, I like the fact that you just went into my second question. So it's about China's attempts to expand their influence in the Pacific. How are the Chinese currently challenging our security in the Pacific region?
The Chinese Navy is striving to be the world's largest Navy. The Chinese Navy regularly now operates farther from its shores, but it's not just the military. The Chinese have the world's largest fishing fleet. They regularly intrude into other countries' exclusive economic zones, including those of the Marshall Islands. Places like the Republic of the Marshall Islands simply do not have the resources to monitor their vast sea areas. So in this regard, the U.S. and other countries do try to provide assistance, but China has no problem strip mining other countries' fishing grounds for their own purposes.
Is that the primary way they economically batter Asian and island governments?
No, sir. They also promise and sometimes deliver, sometimes not, on infrastructure development. They build casinos, such as they have in the Northern Marianas on Saipan. They promise all sorts of investment, including ports and other structures. One should be aware that whenever the Chinese build such structures, it almost always comes with free listening devices included, no charge.
So, have the Chinese successfully exerted influence on nations in the Pacific?
Yes, sir. And undoubtedly for a country like the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which continues to recognize Taiwan as the government for China, the pressure will only increase, both carrots in terms of dangling opportunities, but also almost certainly sticks in terms of limiting access for RMI goods, but also, again, more and more intrusions into fishing grounds and other related natural resources.
So once again, does our current compact of free association with the Marshall Islands, has it impacted Chinese efforts to expand their influence in this region?
Absolutely, sir, because we are under the compact granted exclusive rights to territories and waterways The size of the lagoon of Kwajalein also allows us to try and target warhead test dummies into a very secure area. It's notable that the Chinese have literally fished American underwater drones out of the water. One might call that theft. So being able to get their hands on a nuclear test warhead, a dummy warhead, obviously an inert warhead, but which would be heavily instrumented, would be an intelligence find of the first order.
I agree. Last but not least, this agreement is beneficial to both countries. It would be. Would you agree that this would be benign neglect towards the Republic of the Marshall Islands if we ended or screwed up this type of an agreement?
No, sir, I think it would be an act of active neglect to screw up the agreement. I think that where we are right now, where we are seeing lackadaisical in negotiating an agreement, is barely benign. But what is very clear is that, in my opinion, the agreement is mutually beneficial. It serves the interests of the United States, but I would like to think it also does serve the interests of our allies in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, if only because they are very small population-wise, and they do not have the resources necessary to defend themselves, especially against a concerted political, economic, and military strategy by a nation such as the People's Republic of China.
Thank you, Mr. Cheng. Chairwoman, I want to reiterate, the issue that I've constantly brought over the last 12 years in regards to RICA and the administrative error, not what Congress intended, in the downwinders issue at southeastern Nevada and northwestern Mojave County. It's an issue that still boggles people's minds that we have to add more money to an already an account that still exists just for people to petition to actually get compensation. So I feel the pain in regards to the people from the Marshall Islands. This is something that can be rectified very easily. And I thank you for your indulgence.
Very much, Mr. Gosar. I appreciate that. And sorry that the timer didn't reset. We made sure we gave you your full 5 minutes, and I appreciate your patience with that. I'd now like to recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for holding this important hearing. Foreign Minister Kasten Nemra, can you please give the members of the committee an update on the negotiations on the Compact of Free Association?
Yes, thank you for the question. At the moment, there's not been much progress to date. Last formal meeting was back in December under a previous Trump administration. And knowing that the new administration was coming on board, we've been somewhat anticipating to resume anytime soon. But to date, there's not been an official meeting of such.
And in your professional experience, what should be the framework for these negotiations? What needs to be addressed?
Well, in our view, we hope to first, have a broad understanding on what needs to be discussed, and then that will allow us to really commence constructively. Last rounds last year didn't really progress rather well because the agenda was more or less fixed and established before us without allowing us the opportunity to bring another issue for the talks.
Okay, so do you expect for the U.S. government or any agency from the federal government to meet with community leaders or with anyone from your government to get feedback on this negotiation, on how the negotiation should be conducted?
I'm not aware of such. If that was ever conducted, I'm not aware of it.
Okay, so as this hearing has shown, the people from the U.S. territories have suffered tremendously from the result of their islands being used as military testing sites. In Vieques, Puerto Rico, I am a Puerto Rican American, So I protested the testing sites in Vieques, Puerto Rico. And in Vieques, the cancer rate is 127% higher than on the mainland. So, Foreign Minister, don't you think the Marshallese should be financially compensated for the healthcare challenges they face as a result of nuclear testing? Shouldn't fair compensation be included as part of the compact of free association negotiations?
Yes, I totally agree with you, madam. Yes, I do.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses, and especially Minister Nimra. We really appreciate your being here. I wanted to ask Mr. Chang, you had said in your testimony, you used the term first island chain when discussing hypothetical conventional war with China. Mr. Chang, could you elaborate on what you mean by first island chain in that scenario?
Yes, sir. The first island chain is a term often applied to the string of islands that begins with the Japanese home islands in the north, through Okinawa, the Senkakus, Taiwan, Philippines, down to Singapore. That set of islands, ranging from 100 to a bit more than 100 miles off of the Chinese coast, serves either as a barrier or a shield. If it is in the hands of American allies, then in that case, it limits the ability of the Chinese to surge into the Pacific, to attack sea lanes, to strategically isolate Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. If it is in Chinese hands, then it serves to shield China's strategic and economic center of gravity, which is now on its coast, from possible attacks from the United States. In friendly to the U.S. hands, it is a deterrent to Chinese aggression. In Chinese hands, it provides basically a means of guaranteeing their security. The second island chain, which stretches from the Aleutians through Guam, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, etc., down to Papua New Guinea, is sometimes referred to as a second island chain. It represents an additional set of territories from which the United States and allies might be able to concentrate forces safely, establish intelligence surveillance of Chinese activities, and also provides additional space and other surveillance capacities.
Well, thank you. Well, in that context, then, do you think the Chinese Communist Party sees the Republic of Marshall Islands as ensuring their security?
Should they be able to influence the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia? Absolutely. It would give them a further ability to push us back to Hawaii. It would basically guarantee their dominance of the Western Pacific. And let me note here, that means the industries of the Western Pacific, including computers, microchips, semiconductors, etc. It would allow them to have what we have right now, which is strategic depth and ability to see things coming, whether in space or terrestrially. So absolutely, all of the Central Pacific island states are potentially key targets for Chinese influence operations and strategic gain.
Well, if China, say hypothetically, were to make a move on Taiwan militarily, could you envision them moving on the Marshall Islands at some point?
Not at the same time in all likelihood, but that region would almost certainly be in the target basket for Chinese intermediate range ballistic missiles, which can range as far as Guam. The DF-26 we know can do that. There have been recent tests, of course, of Chinese hypersonic vehicles. That would be something that I would expect to target American systems in the region west of Hawaii, which would obviously potentially include the Republic of the Marshall Islands. There would also be cyber and other efforts to terrorize and attack any state that did not basically align with the Chinese.
See, well, let me ask, and this has been a matter of confusion, and my time is very short, but was there more radioactive damage to the Marshall Islands than to a combination of Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Who are you asking, sir?
Oh, Mr. Chang, if you can.
I am not a nuclear physicist, and I do not work for the Department of Energy. What I would say is that the yield for a number of these devices, including the Castle Bravo test, was significantly larger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were urban targets and also military targets in time of war. There were not people at ground zero in the Marshalls. Let me also note here that while Castle Bravo was the largest American test at 15 megatons, it actually was smaller than 4 other tests conducted by the Soviet Union, which ranged as high as 50 megatons.
Well, but thank you. My time's expired. Appreciate it, Chair.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Leyland, in your testimony, you described stories of displacement and that as a community, you are engulfed with complicated immigration issues in the U.S. In fact, you state this should be dealt as a high priority and should acknowledge that the pathway to naturalization or citizenship should be part of that of a relocation plan. Can you describe what are the consequences for your community if we don't act?
I think there's going to be, once again, permanent scars and permanent displacement. I think right after the nuclear testing, what happened to some of those islanders who were directly impacted by the nuclear, they were spread out through the islands on the Marshall Islands. And really, they had to relive how to live, survive again. Some of them were forced out to live in isolated islands where they had to basically relearn the process of living again. So I think it is our American responsibility to ensure that we no longer further disconnect them to their homes. Many of them are still looking for a permanent home.
Thank you for that. And do you foresee Congress acting on this in specific legislation for the Marshallese people?
I do not know of any, if there is one going on right now, and if there's a plan. And I do that. The reason why I proposed it on there is because I think we owe it to the people who we permanently dislocate them from there and detach them forever from their own lands.
Very well. Thank you for sharing that. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Moore, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member. I think it will come as no surprise to my colleagues that I'm going to talk a little bit about the China expansion, South China Sea, and some of the geopolitical conflicts that we have there. Like I had mentioned before, I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee. So thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My questions will be for Mr. Dean Chang. You know, we have a challenge with how to deal with China's expansion. That's even highlighted this week with the test of their hypersonic delivery system. It's top of mind to many Americans, to the international community, to our allies, and I see this relationship with Marshall Islands as very strategic in us to be able to thwart and combat that as much as possible. Mr. Chang, I appreciate your testimony. As we kind of look into the future and as the threat landscape in the Pacific continually evolves, can you speak to how China is seeking to build diplomatic, economic, and not only just military, but diplomatic and economic ties with our allies in the Pacific. So all three of those, like, they're taking a multi-pronged approach: diplomatic, economic, and military. Can you just speak to that a little bit, with particularly to our allies?
The Chinese pursue a very comprehensive, integrated approach. It helps that they have state-owned enterprises, which don't have to pay attention to whether or not they make a profit, and the fact that the banking system is also state-run, which means that they will extend loans to state-owned enterprises. This means that Chinese construction companies, in particular, will often bid on infrastructure projects in places like the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia. They would, if they could, on Guam. As well as throughout Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, they have tried to build, contract to build facilities, 5G networks, etc., in places like Australia and elsewhere. We know that Chinese construction efforts often literally are riddled with intelligence gathering equipment. The organization, the African Union's headquarters, which was built by a Chinese company in Addis Ababa, turned out to be downloading the entire building's information network. Every computer was basically downloading information back to Beijing at 3 in the morning when nobody was there. This was automated. This is the kind of thing that the Chinese do. The Chinese will invest, the Chinese will court, the Chinese will do political moves, the Chinese will fish. Fishing sometimes is licensed, often is not. And of course, they have a growing military whose ability to show the flag and openly undertake intelligence and military operations is expanding deeply into the Central Pacific. We are watching Chinese bombers go deeper and deeper into the Pacific, armed with air-launched cruise missiles.
And the key to this was how receptive foreign nations are to China's efforts to build these diplomatic and security ties. What's your opinion on how well it's working? I think the success that we've actually had over this last few years of combating Huawei, being able to become sort of a global presence. Our allies recognize the threat of Huawei. You just highlighted exactly what I'm talking about. So give us a sense for just other nations and how receptive they are to this.
When we inform them of the realities, we find that they are often very receptive. As you noted, a number of nations have switched their positions regarding Huawei, but we have to take a proactive stance. In Papua New Guinea, we and the Australians basically persuaded them to turn down a massive Chinese offer to build what would have been a naval base there. The problem is that the Chinese can walk and chew gum at the same time. They are pushing every country all the time, and we seem much more episodic. So when we respond, it is well received, but they're acting everywhere, and we're only acting in some places.
Excellent. The Trump administration began efforts to renegotiate the Compact of Free Association, set to expire in 2023. What, if anything, would you like to see changed in the new agreement?
I think that one of the things that would be helpful, and we're seeing this at this hearing, would be a greater role for the State Department. It is, I am not a diplomatic historian, so I don't pretend to understand exactly why insular affairs housed in the Department of the Interior seems to have one of the leading roles. But if we are going to have an integrated, comprehensive response to Chinese efforts to dominate the Central Pacific, then that needs a greater role for the State Department, which would also mean better direct negotiations between ourselves and folks like the foreign minister from the Republic of the Marshall Islands.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair. I yield back. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablan, for 5 minutes.
Right. Thank you again, Madam Chair. Let's see, I'm trying to, I have 3 sets of questions here, but Secretary Mori, let's continue our conversation, if I may. The United States.
Mr. Sablan, we have dismissed the first panel. So if you could please direct your questions to the second panel of witnesses.
Right. Okay, so I saw Mr. Murray appear and then he disappeared. So let me go up to the Republic of the Marshall Islands Foreign Minister, the Honorable Nemra. Did I say that right, Minister Nemra? Okay, thank you. Minister Nemra, the negotiations for the compact between the Republic of the Marshall Islands, just as well as for the Federated States of Micronesia, were announced more than 2 years ago. Has there been any agreement reached on any issue between the Republic, your government, and the United States?
No.
Would you know if the state and interior teams are willing to discuss an agenda for the talks?
We would hope so. We like to, broaden the agenda and bring issue we recognize as important, including the nuclear legacy. And at the moment, it's not yet on the table as far as I'm aware of.
Right. So, because I understand, sir, that your government requested the United States to discuss the scope and agenda for the compact negotiations. And so, would you know if the state and interior teams insist on a limited agenda that excluded the nuclear testing and waste issue?
Yeah, it's an issue that it's not being formally agreed by both parties that we discussed, whether for lack of authority or suppose not interested in bringing that issue. But for us, it's very critical and important that we bring the issue to light and have an opportunity to talk and discuss how we can move forward.
Right, and because with all due respect, the former Assistant Secretary for Insular Affairs was negotiating, and I think a former ambassador to the Marshall Islands was allowed where the negotiating team, the state and interior teams, and like you say, probably lacked the authority, and so but are you aware of the U.S. confidentiality proposal from the U.S. last year that would have prevented the Republic of the Marshall Islands from talking to Congress or talking to the two other freely associated states, the Federated States of Micronesia and Palau, these two other nations? Are you aware of that, sir?
Yes, I'm very aware of that, and we reject it in its entirety.
Thank you. And my final question for you, Minister, are there active negotiations underway?
Not at the moment.
Are there already plans for when talks will start, at least to set up an agenda?
We hope to set those soon, but no definite date yet.
But is the Republic of the Marshall ready and willing to start negotiations, sir?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Very much. The chair now recognizes the representative from American Samoa, Ms. Rattlewagon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Porter. I want to thank the second panel for also appearing today and for their testimonies. Ms. Moss Christian, in your testimony, you mentioned that many of your islands remain unsafe for resettlement. I couldn't even imagine losing a part of American Samoa's ancestral land and the damage it would do to our culture. Could you elaborate on the remediation necessary for these islands and some of the health challenges that the people of the Marshall Islands face?
Thank you, Representative Rattlewagon, for the question. The islands of Bikini Atoll and Rongelap Atoll and most of the islands in Enewetak Atoll are still unsafe to support communities to come back. The remediation required for those islands was actually detailed in the Nuclear Claims Tribunal property damage awards that were given to those atoll governments. And those awards included remediation strategies and costs for those strategies. There are other islands that have been assessed, that have gone through environmental assessment and had some levels of contamination, not quite as high. And then there are still some islands that have never had an environmental assessment. So there's a mixture of environmental status.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sablan. The chair would now like to give each of our witnesses 60 seconds to be able to make any further remarks that they would like to make that they did not have a chance to make. And if you don't wish to, you can simply let me know. We'll start with you, Minister Custin Nemra.
Thank you, Madam Chair Porter. I'd like to say that Marshall Island is very keen to proceed with these negotiations. Over the past year, we did resume these negotiations, but sadly, the agenda was fixed. It was on a very specific provision that we thought it was not adequate, and we want to broaden the issue, including the nuclear issue. This is partly why, in our view, that the negotiation thus far has rather moved slowly. We hope that both parties should be able to allow each other to bring issue of importance to the table so we can have a really open and honest dialogue and discuss how we can move forward and strengthen the compact of free association. Marshall Island continues to be a committed ally of the United States, and we intended to do so. But we hope through this negotiation process will allow us the opportunity to bring these other issues that are key to us, including the nuclear legacy, in particular, some of the provision under 177 with the trust fund that was established but has been depleted, and the promise is yet to be fulfilled. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I'll now recognize Mr. Cheng. If you have any final comments you wish to make in the next minute, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I have to admit that I am startled at the lack of negotiations that other witnesses have pointed to. And I can only say that given the looming threat posed by the People's Republic of China, it is my hope that both the executive and the legislative branch will work together to basically get these talks moving, because time is running out, and there are others out there who are watching and waiting to step in and to exploit the opportunity that we would be presenting them on a silver platter. Thank you very much.
Ms. Leyland, any final remarks you wish to make?
Yes, we continue to see a lot of disconnection to services, especially with our disabled children. A lot of Marshallese and COFA citizens are not eligible to things like SSI. Also, we're paying into these programs, so we do pay our taxes. However, we cannot have access to things like SSI as well as SNAP. And I think a lot of that has to do with policy. Again, we're not designed, the policies that we're experiencing now are not designed to accommodate non-immigrant status as part of, again, Marshallese non-immigration status. Thank you.
Ms. Leyland. Ms. Moss-Christian?
Thank you, Chair Porter. Just to stress the need to address these outstanding nuclear testing issues, which have gone on for too many decades, and the opportunity that the compact discussions provide to do that. And to say that, just to reiterate the importance of connecting with the communities and to hearing the communities' voices and concerns directly, especially those who have been displaced and remain displaced, and those who are battling health issues, but who are living with the nuclear legacy on a daily basis. So just to stress that cooperation and the community importance. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And
I'm
sorry,
not.
Mr. Sablan?
Can I just say an observation here, 20 seconds, please?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just today's hearing, I see the two difference of how urgent our three witnesses on this panel, how urgent and serious they are about negotiating the compact, and how our earlier panels seem to have take this on in a rather, maybe not intentionally, but maybe for the lack of authority. Just do not take this matter as serious as these three former trust territory citizens are. I am a former trust territory citizen myself. And just that difference, we need to address this, because eventually this is going to go the way of the last Republic of Palau Compact, where it took Congress 8 years to approve. Madam Chair, I'm willing to work with you, whatever it takes to get this negotiation moving for these people we need. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Mr. Gosar, if you wish to make a closing statement, I'm happy to recognize you or not, as is your preference, but I want to acknowledge my appreciation for your cooperation in having this hearing and an exceptional level of bipartisan cooperation and our commitment to working together on these issues. If you wish to make a closing statement, I would be happy to give you that time.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. And I want to thank the gentleman, Mr. Sablan. I think that shows an urgency that we need to get to push this administration to finish up these negotiations and go to bat in good faith and goodwill. So I would suggest, this is just a suggestion to the chair, that a letter be formulated from the committee directing, the traffic, so to speak, and have the administration come back with answers to who's facilitating this, when is it going to be accomplished by, and who are all the people involved in these discussions, so that maybe we can push these negotiations to get done and set a precedent, for timely negotiations and fairness in the negotiations across the ocean to these countries. I think it's, in talking about the nuclear resolve in regards to RICA, we've been negligent over time. Like I showed in Nevada and Arizona. And constantly we've been pushed aside when it was an administrative error. That's why we have to have this oversight, to make sure that we follow through, make sure that those laws that we pass are enforced properly and that meet every detail that we decide to make. So I think I would join you in writing a letter to find that to this administration, timing, who's going to be responsible, and the importance of getting this negotiation taken care of and done in fairness and equity. So I want to thank you. The other thing I really want to stress, Chairwoman, is that, this meeting shows exactly why we need to start meeting in person. I really got to tell you, because the impact that these people have had and the difficulty that we've also had paramounts what we should be doing to make sure that we have direct face-to-face conversations, to make sure that we're forwarding the exertion that we need to see with the priority of the skill set that needs to come to an issue like this. So I thank you very much for bringing this forward. Thank you for all the participation from everybody. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And, Mr. Castanamara, I want you to know that I don't know how much you have a chance to observe about United States politics, but when you have Representative Gosar and Representative Porter in strong agreement, I want you to take that as this best possible evidence that the United States Congress is going to work on a bipartisan basis to address the nuclear legacy and to make sure that we are setting these negotiations, setting the stage for the negotiations to go forward on the best possible way. The point of the hearing today was to examine why the United States is not willing to discuss the nuclear legacy, with the Marshallese. We know it's not happening, and it is completely permissible and possible. The resistance is on the side of the United States government, and I think it's going to be very difficult for us to start the negotiations with regard to COFA and to hopefully extend COFA unless we act on the moral and national security imperative that we have to address that nuclear legacy. At today's hearing, we heard that the Department of Energy is sending letters with incorrect statements of fact, that the Department of Interior is potentially proceeding under a misinterpretation of the law, and that the Department of State's major participation in today's hearing was to tweet rather than to testify. And that is a recipe for failure. It is not what we owe our allies in the Marshall Islands, and it is not going to restore the United States to its role as a leader in the world, consistent with the goals of the Biden administration. And so I will take Mr. Gosar up on his offer to continue working on these issues. And I want to again thank each of our panelists, both in panel 1 and panel 2, for being with us today. I also want to remind everybody that the members of the committee may have some more questions for you. If we do, we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and we'll hold the hearing record open for 10 business days so that you can respond. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.